Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center. Today in the virtual reading group, we're continuing to read through Hannah Arendt's book, The Crisis of the Republic. This is a book that I often recommend to people as a first book to read of Hannah Arendt's. It's not so philosophical. These are all essays and one interview that were published in either the New Yorker or the New York Review of Books. This particular essay on civil disobedience was published September 12th, 1970. So in the midst of many struggles around civil disobedience. Arendt says at the beginning of the essay that she takes her point of departure from a question asked by the Bar Association of the City of New York, namely, what is the citizen's moral relation to law in a society of consent? She's going to say a number of things about that question. One is that a society of consent is very rare. She thinks that America, the United States of America, is one of the few countries that at least at times have had such a society, although she's going to raise a lot of questions about that. She's going to question the questions, focus on a moral relation to law in a society of consent. And what she's going to at least question the fact that civil disobedience has a moral foundation. This is the traditional view of civil disobedience for those of us who study it through people like Socrates and Thoreau and Gandhi. And there's an idea that civil disobedience comes from something like the conscientious objector, that person who has either out of religion or some sort of moral feeling simply says, I can't fight this war, I can't do this, I won't pay my taxes to support slavery, and so they dissent and disobey the law and take their punishment. And that's the third element of this original way she frames this question. She says that people who argue for civil disobedience say, well, if you're going to make a moral argument that you disobey a law based on your morality, you have to back up your morality and accept punishment and allow yourself to be put in jail or punished as the law requires for breaking the law. She's going to dissent from these traditional understandings of civil disobedience, and she's going to make a fairly powerful, I think very powerful argument that civil disobedience is not moral but political. That civil disobedience comes not from an individual moral actor, but from a collective acting for political ends in a political way, an organized minority, as she will call it. And so the true character of civil disobedience, as she's going to write on page 55, is that it's not conscientious objection, and that in civil disobedience we are faced by the fact of organized minorities bound together by common opinion rather than by common interests, and the decision to take a stand against the government's policies, even if they have reason to assume that these policies are backed by the majority. So even if the policies are backed by a majority and thus legal, civil disobedience unite around a common opinion, not around a common interest. And that's going to be an interesting distinction that she will make. And they object to and refuse to follow the legitimate, otherwise legitimate law of the majority. So that's sort of the basic idea here. Part one of the essay is where she turns to Thoreau and Socrates and says, our traditional ideas of civil disobedience come out of Thoreau and Socrates. We could add Gandhi, but she doesn't. And she says that they see civil disobedience as a matter of conscience. They are the rules of conscience. They say, don't do this. Keep your soul clean or your conscience clean. As Thoreau says, I wash my hands of the matter. In that sense, she says, civil disobedience and conscience are unpolitical and subjective. They are entirely negative. They say what not to do, but not what to do. And because they're subjective, they can never be proven. They can't be argued for except to say, I think this. This is better to me. And so they become nothing more than an opinion. In the marketplace, the fate of conscience is not much different from the fate of philosopher's truth. It becomes an opinion, indistinguishable from other opinions, she writes on page 68. And so she will now dissent from this traditional idea of civil disobedience as an opinion and instead argue that civil disobedience is not an opinion, but an act of politics. It's not a crime, right? It's not a criminal act, and it's not a revolution. So what is it? Well, it's a political act. I'm going to keep coming back to this because it's core to what she's saying. It's against those who argue otherwise, she says. Civil disobedience is not a cause of general disobedience in our time. It's not, there may be a lot of lawlessness out there, but that's not because of civil disobedience. The civil disobedient, unlike the criminal, acts in public. He doesn't hide, or she doesn't hide what she does. It's an act of dissent from the majority, but it acts in the name of a group, not in my individual interest. I'm not trying to better myself. And this is why she says before that the civil disobedient acts out of opinion, group opinion, not out of group interest. We're not simply a lobbyist group seeking our interests, although she says those can be like voluntary associations. Civil disobedience is actually about saying, not we're pursuing our interest, but our opinion about what is right and wrong differs from the majority, and we're not trying to make an exception for ourselves. We're trying to change the majority's opinion. That's a key element of what civil disobedience is. So, and she says on page 76, the point is that we are dealing here with organized minorities that are too important, not merely in numbers, but in quality of opinion, to be safely disregarded. Organized minorities that are too important, let's say both in number and in quality of opinion. Well, number I think we can understand. If it's a group of people arguing for civil rights or against the Vietnam War, we can see how big they are. And the numbers, insofar as they're big, can't be disregarded. Quality of opinion is a harder one, but what she's saying is, I think the argument would be that if you actually bring large numbers of a minority together, even if you're not a majority, your opinion is going to have a certain quality to it because it has to attract a wide range of people. And in so doing, it's not just my belief, it has a certain quality to it. At the same point, she says, even though civil disobedience is not a revolution and it's not criminal, it shares with a revolution or a revolutionary the desire to change the world. And she has this very fascinating few pages on the importance of change and its relation to civil disobedience. In brief, the world changes all the time. It has throughout history. Our time is distinguished not by the fact that the world changes, but that the change has faster. It goes ever faster. And she says what we need today is to be able to have change alongside stability, because both change and stability are absolutely inherent in the needs of human beings. And so the danger, she says, is that as change becomes faster and faster, we will lose stability, and we will actually lose lawfulness and open ourselves up to things like totalitarianism. And so civil disobedience, she says, is important because it's a way to speed up change. you could speed up change through civil disobedience, and yet, because the civil disobedience is still preaches fidelity to lawfulness, even though you break the law in the name of a higher law or a better law. You don't actually pose yourself as a rebel to the legal system. It's a way of speeding up change without actually threatening stability. And so she uses as her example of this the civil rights movement. And she says that for 100 years, the 14th Amendment basically did nothing. It failed. The 14th Amendment was not enforced for 100 years until the civil rights movement and civil disobedience forced the issue and changed popular opinion so that the 14th Amendment would be actually enforced as she thinks it was meant to be. And so she says that's how civil disobedience can speed up change, but do so in a way that has a certain fidelity to stability and lawfulness. The third part of the essay, the last part of the essay, which is the longest part, makes a much more complicated and nuanced argument about how civil disobedience is legal, as I was just saying, and that she says it's consistent with the spirit of the law, at least in the United States of America. And she's going to here make a number of claims about the United States and America. It's not that civil disobedience is consistent with particular laws. It's not. It breaks particular laws, but it's consistent with the spirit of American law. And she's going to end with a claim that actually it's so consistent with the spirit of American law that we should either explicitly make a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to civil disobedience, or we should recognize somewhere in the penumbras of the Constitution that civil disobedience is a right. The basic idea here is that America is a society of consent, not of vertical consent in a Hobbesian sense, but of what she calls horizontal consent in the way that John Locke speaks about it. And in that idea, it's not that everyone, of course, consents to be here and thus to the laws in any formal way. Of course, that's a fiction. But that she says there's a kind of tacit consent in the United States to what she'll call a universal consensus. And this tacit consent, which she says includes the idea of self-government and the right to dissent, is part of what she calls the American art of association and the spirit of the American law. I'll point out that she is building here on Tocqueville, and she follows Tocqueville also in saying that the greatest threat to this American idea of tacit consent and horizontal consent, horizontal mutuality, is the fact that the entire American experiment of democracy, as it emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, excluded two groups of people, at least. Tocqueville says the Indians, the Native Americans, and Black Americans. We could add in women as well, and probably other groups if we wanted to. And what Tocqueville said is that the great danger to the American experiment in democracy would come not from slavery, which could be done away with, but from what we might call racism. The idea that even if we got rid of slavery, people like Jefferson and Lincoln still thought black and white could not live together and sought to create separate worlds for them. And so Arendt says that in order to bring these groups, especially black Americans, into the universal consent of the United States, there should have been an amendment, and she argues in other essays that we should still pass an amendment that explicitly welcomes and says that Black Americans are part of the United States. She says that given the original crime excluding them, we actually need an explicit statement re-including them back in to the universal consent, the tacit consent of the United States. I'm going to largely end there. I want to just point out there's a lot we can talk about consent, and I hope you'll ask questions about it, and we can talk about it. But I want to, every time you read a text of Arendt's, or I read a text of Arendt's, or any text, you find one or two things you never saw before, new things. And this time I found one, and it's on page 97 to 98, and I thought I'd at least bring it up as a way of introducing this conversation. She's talking about this idea of civil disobedience as the latest form of voluntary association in America, largely drawn out of Tocqueville. And she says that civil disobedience, like voluntary associations, are dangerous. And Tocqueville understood that they were dangerous. They're dangerous in a couple ways. One is that when you have a voluntary association, whatever it is, call it a bowling league, it's possible that someone's going to dominate it, and that there's going to be a kind of tyrannical exclusionary force. So you have you could have a women's march, and there could be people who say, if you're of this belief, you're not allowed to be in the women's march, and you could be part of a group, and people say, if you're not of this color or race or religion, you can't be in this group. And so she says voluntary associations are dangerous because they can be tyrannical. This is on page 97. And she says, but even though they're dangerous, they are worth the danger, because in these voluntary associations, she says, Americans learn the art of rendering the dangers of freedom less formidable. In practicing the art of associating with others, we learn the art of rendering the dangers of associations, namely that they can become tyrannical, less formidable. And how does that happen? Well, it's because when we are in an association, we actually have to encounter people we disagree with, and we have to learn to work with them. And it's in that experience of working with someone and learning to encounter people who are in your association and they share things with you and yet are different from you, that you learn what it means to be a free and democratic citizen. And then she says at the bottom of the page, and this is what really struck me and I hadn't really noticed before, she says, this is on bottom of 97 into 98, under today's circumstances, this could happen, namely the evil demons where these dangers would get unleashed, if these groups, if these voluntary associations, like their counterparts in other countries, were to substitute ideological commitments, political or other, for actual goals. When an association is no longer capable of willing to unite into one channel the efforts of divergent minds, it has lost its gift for action. And this strikes me as something deeply prescient and meaningful today. When voluntary associations no longer organize towards a goal, towards an opinion, but organize and insist on a kind of ideological purity, on ideological commitments, then they don't actually serve as training grounds for democracy and freedom, because you don't actually learn to address and engage with people who have different opinions, who share an opinion that you find very important but are different from you. And so that is, she says, the great threat to any civil disobedient movement is ideology and the importation of ideology into groups. And I think that's something I believe is happening in all sorts of different voluntary associations and groups today, where instead of being organized by interest or by opinion, more and more we're being organized by ideology. And that's for her a grave danger in the understanding of how voluntary associations and civil disobedience is supposed to work. So let me stop there and ask if there's any comments or questions at the beginning here, and then we'll go into discussion.
Hi, Roger.
Yeah.
Hi, it's Margaret.
Hi, Margaret.
I guess a concern I had reading through this whole essay was that a certain amount of it is premised upon an understanding of the law and the legal system that strikes me as not accurate. To be sure, the legal system is to promote, does have, the idea of promoting a certain amount of stability, i.e. you understand what the confines and parameters of accepted and unaccepted actions are and are not. But the law, by people in various different groups at different ends of the political spectrum, is thought of as evolving. We may not agree altogether on how it should evolve or by what criteria, but this notion that somehow there is this rock hard precedent and all the change happens outside of SCOTUS, and then it comes there to sort of be ratified because of some sort of majority public opinion, is wrong, and importantly wrong because she doesn't then see the opportunity and the utility precisely of civil disobedience to move the law, whether you consider it's forward or the wrong way. And I would say that, for example, to cite a couple concrete examples in the text, yes, assuredly, the 14th Amendment didn't go in and solve everything, but it took 100 years before there was a move to say that no, separate is not equal. There were actions taken in accordance with the Equal Protection Act that we, in the modern age, no longer considered sufficient. At a different end of politics, there was, just as there was suffrage given to women, and we still don't have an Equal Rights Amendment, so nobody was pretending at either of those points that those singular acts solved all issues, whether with regard to Black Americans or to female Americans. And if you want to see a movement of the law on ostensibly the other end of the political spectrum, I would say, what about Citizens United saying, yes, that does give the court, in contrast to what she's saying, the ability to look at things in a different category, to not just say on page 99, the only non-criminal lawbreaker the court recognizes is the conscientious objector. Well, now that you can say that a corporation is a person, that's non-criminal. The court can recognize that. And all kinds of things flow from that. So I'm concerned that, if the foundation of the argument is built on this somewhat shaky premises, the idea of having constitutional amendments is not really needed if you understand how the law is supposed to work that way. I don't know if that followed. But.
So, as someone who comes from the legal world, these are questions that I think are important and interesting. As I always teach my students, there's the famous, if you stand across the Seine in Paris and you look at the the Paris Court of Justice, up on top it says, ora fugit lex stat, right? Time flies, but law stands the same. The law stays the same. Now, Margaret, you're saying that that's wrong, right? That laws change, and of course you're right. Laws change all the time. Specific laws through legislatures, through changing customs, etc. But law is a generally conservative, stabilizing part of our human society. And while laws can change, the general premise of law is that they have to change in an orderly way. And in a democracy, they change largely through majority rule, which means you have to convince a majority. And sometimes majorities are resistant, and sometimes it's just not the main concern of the majority.
But that's the case for the legislature, which is meant to represent, we could certainly debate whether it's the case these days, but the legislature is meant to represent the majority, but the Supreme Court was meant precisely to protect the minority that won't get it.
So let's understand that Arendt on page 90, I think, says, look, here what I'm talking about is page 89, is a particular moment. She says we're in a constitutional crisis. We are confronted with a constitutional crisis of the first order. And this has been affected by two very different factors, she says. First is the unconstitutional acts by the administration, here the Johnson administration and others, leading to a withdrawal of consent, largely around the Vietnam War she's talking about. And if you'll recall the end of the essay, what she says is, when people brought legal cases, the court pleaded what's called the political question doctrine, which says that in important, no one actually knows exactly what it says, but basically what it says is that in important matters that go to the heart of politics, the court is not going to make a decision. And so what Arendt says is the court has abdicated its constitution, in her mind, its constitutional responsibility to do what you're saying it should do, which is to protect minorities and protect against the abuse of power by majorities in this huge range of questions, which it calls the political question doctrine. And so she says, for that level, we have a constitutional crisis. And the other is on the unwillingness of certain sectors of the population to recognize the consensus universalis. And here she's talking about both the exclusion of minorities, but also, and so the tacit exclusion from the tacit consensus of minorities, as she says on page 91, but also then the refusal of then some minorities to then try and enter back into the tacit, this universal consensus. And what she says is, at moments of constitutional crisis, neither the legislature nor the court is working. The court didn't work because of the political question doctrine around the Vietnam War, and it didn't work around the 14th Amendment and around racism because it refused to enforce the 14th Amendment. And so what she says in those circumstances, the conservatism of the law needs a push, but one that's not illegal, but is fundamentally attuned to legality and to the legal spirit of the rules and laws of the country. And that's her argument of what civil disobedience is. So it's not that she doesn't think the law can change. What she's saying is, A, it's slow, and in a time of faster generational change, it's going to seem even more out of touch, which I think is just true. And secondly, the court is not always going to take up that slack, either because of the political question doctrine or because it just doesn't around the civil rights amendments. So I don't know if that helps, Margaret, or maybe you just disagree with her. I mean,
No, I tend to agree with her in her recitation of the problems, and I see their applicability in many ways to what's going on now. I just was a bit thrown at the end of the essay, the idea of what sounded like, let's set up civil disobedience lobbyists and have some constitutional amendments. And I thought, okay, that's certainly not gradual, trivial, or slow, but is that really the right answer? So it's more about her prescription rather than her description.
okay. Yeah, I mean, whether you actually need an amendment would depend on the question of whether civil disobedience were being rounded up and put in jail, right? As long as civil disobedience are accepted as the kind of legal political actors she's arguing they are, then what she says is civil disobedience has become incorporated into the Constitution, whether it's explicit or not. What she's saying is we may not want to trust that, and therefore there may be an argument for an explicit amendment. But that's a different question. Her basic argument is that we need to understand that civil disobedience is actually deeply consistent with the spirit of the country, whether that's explicitly put into an amendment or more implicitly understood by the way we treat it and act according to it. Are there other thoughts or comments on this or other parts of the text? Some of you I know were at the conference we did on civil disobedience last year, in which a lot of these questions were brought up. The main text that we used as sort of the quote to found that conference or to ground that conference is found on page 89 in this text, and it reads, and it's again regarding this question of consent, and she says there is a tacit consent, she wants to argue, to a kind of American legality, a spirit of American law, which she calls the right to dissent, and also the right to self-government. And then on page 89, she says, this consent, I think, is indeed entirely fictitious, namely consent to specific laws. I'm sorry, a different kind of consent. Under present circumstances, at any rate, it has lost all plausibility. Representative government itself is in crisis today, partly because it has lost, in the course of time, all institutions that permitted the citizens' actual participation, and partly because it is now gravely affected by the disease from which the party system suffers, bureaucratization, and the two parties' tendency to represent nobody except the party machines. So, to me, this is one of those quotes that you could probably teach a whole class on, and we could think about for hours. Representative government, the idea that we don't have direct democracy, but we elect representatives to govern us in our name, is in crisis today because it has lost, in the course of time, all institutions that permitted the citizens' actual participation. So what institutions has representative government lost that required the students' actual participation? Well, one I think that she's clearly thinking of is something along the lines of town hall meetings, in which people actually went to their town hall and talked to each other. But I think also voluntary associations, to the extent that they were active and that you actively engaged in them, and encountered other people and engaged people who shared your opinion but were divergent from you in many things, didn't have a common ideology. What other institutions might she be talking about that permitted citizens actual participation? Well, one that we have that continues to this day is the jury system. That's a way in which individuals, citizens, participate in our self-government. But there aren't that many others. I think that's what she's saying. I think what she's saying is that back when government was smaller, representative government was smaller, there were many more ways that people actually engaged in self-government. And as we live increasingly in bigger cities and with more bureaucracy, most of us feel, she argues this in another essay, and in fact on violence, which we'll read next week, disempowered, where we feel separated from action, from praxis Entzug, the withdrawal of our ability to make a difference. And as a result, we, in a sense, allow the government to govern us, not ourselves governing ourselves. And this is for her the source of the crisis. And so her embrace of civil disobedience is because it is the modern way, she thinks, that we return citizens to self-government. We bring citizens back into an institutional way. And it's a funny thing to think about civil disobedience as institutional. But I think that's actually how she's thinking about it. It's an organization, an organized minority. It's not just my view. And as an organized minority, we have leaders and we have norms, and we become part of a movement of sorts, an institutional place for us to participate in government. And thus, insofar as we dissent, we consent to being part of that government, which is why dissent is the root of consent in America, in her view. And so, to me, this is an absolutely central part of understanding what she means about the importance of civil disobedience. I don't know if that strikes anybody as meaningful. I mean, one thing to think about is where and how do we understand civil disobedience today, right? Where do you see examples of civil disobedience today? I mean, Occupy Wall Street was one example to a certain degree. I mean, in the sense that the protests were illegal and that they didn't ask for permits. The Tea Party was an act of civil disobedience as well. It did things illegally. So, but there are others, and certainly Black Lives Matter and other groups have become the modern versions of the civil rights movement and civil disobedience. And for her, we have to understand that these are absolutely deeply American movements, and they shouldn't be demonized or punished or seen as criminal.
Roger, I'd like to comment on some of the things that you said here. I'm sorry, this is Jack. First of all, during the period that she's talking about, I actually participated in many civil disobedient acts, together with groups like the American Friends Service Committee and the Fellowship of Reconciliation and groups like that. Spent a little time in a cell too, but because it was civil disobedience. And I want to try to distinguish between civil disobedience and nonviolent action, which nonviolent action does not necessarily challenge a law. Nonviolent action can be used to protest, and protest and legal challenge are not the same. So I think that it's a place of confusion for some people because civil disobedience is really quite narrow. It is the refusal or an act that demonstrates one's refusal to abide by an existing law. That is a challenge directly to the law. And there are many protests. I've participated in millions of those protests that don't actually challenge the law, just challenge other political actions. So I just want to make sure that distinction is clear. I also want to challenge a little bit her sense of the disappearance of institutions. You're right. I think that probably the last surviving institution is the town hall, but and that I think that really reflects the triumph of a hierarchy of influence in politics. There is a hierarchy of influence, and instead of trying to get together with your fellow citizens to do this, that, or the other, you try to put yourself in a position where you know the judge or you know the person in the political party who has the influence, that is seeking influence in that way, a kind of a fracturing of whatever was once existed. But there are actually town halls going on, and if you think about the caucuses in the election process, there are some states that where there are caucuses. The issue for me, the crisis, is not so much that the institutions have disappeared, but rather that they have lost the confidence of the public.
Can I say something, Roger? I wanted to say that right now the visible civil disobedience is actually coming from the executive branch, because we are seeing, no, this is not, I'm not being facetious, I'm serious. I think that when I read this, I was thinking that this is all really, really interesting, but what we're seeing today is a total disregard for the law, a total disobedience, perhaps, to those institutions for reasons that are certainly not necessarily moral, ethical, whatever, but it's a total defiance of the institutions, and it's coming right from the government, which is something that I don't think she had any inkling could happen in America.
Well, I think she thinks at the period she's writing, a similar thing is happening in America. I mean, the whole premise of the constitutional crisis is what she considers to be unconstitutional acts by almost a criminal administration during the Vietnam War. That is not being that the courts basically punted on it through the political questions doctrine. So, and as someone who lived, through both Nazism and then through the Vietnam War, I mean, she's perfectly well aware of how administrations can become lawbreakers.
But I think she felt that the American institutions were significantly more robust, that certainly the judiciary and all these institutions that she writes about in other places would be able to manage or subvert such complete disregard for the law from the highest office in the land. I think this is what's so hard when you read Hannah Arendt, who has lived through these things and is so clear-minded about them. There is absolutely no, I don't think, any expectation that in a society of the American experiment that such a thing could happen, I think.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that happens here is she's shocked by what she considers to be the abdication by both the legislative branches and by the judiciary branch. I think she was legitimately shocked that the judiciary didn't declare an undeclared war unconstitutional. I mean, it's very explicit in the Constitution that Congress has the right to declare war, and Vietnam War was an undeclared war, and for many people at the time, it was considered to be an unconstitutional war. And because the court basically said this is a political question and we're not going to get involved, I think she was shocked by that. And so what she does, and this goes back to Margaret's question as well, but is to say we have other resources in the United States. We're resilient, not just the courts, but we have civil disobedience, and we have voluntary associations, and that muscle sometimes atrophies, right? We use them less. But then, as Jack said, people can come out. And I think Arendt was pleasantly shocked by all the different student movements and protests. She thinks, she has a very complicated relation to many of them because she thinks that many of them did things she doesn't like and had excesses. And she says here, these kind of actions, these kind of voluntary associations are dangerous. They can often be ideological. They can often be racist. They can often be sexist. They're not often pretty. And I think a lot of us, looking at things like Black Lives Matter or Occupy or the resistance movement or the Tea Party, we look at these movements and we point to things they do and we say, they're racist, or that's ideological, or that's wrong. And we're right to do that. Absolutely. But what I think is also important to do is to celebrate the fact that people are engaged and people are resisting, and people, when they see injustice or they see something they think is wrong, they get out in the streets. They don't just have a protest. And I think Jack is the distinction Jack made between protest and civil disobedience is important. They don't just protest. They organize and they are willing to break laws in order to make their point. And that, it's not that only happens in America. It doesn't. It happens elsewhere. But in other countries, protest is a much more visible idea. But in the United States, civil disobedience really, that was a core American idea, and it comes from this idea of the voluntary association and the idea of that we as Americans have the right to resist when we think our government is going down a wrong path. And so, all I would say is, while she does think the country has resiliences and is resilient against law breaking of the administrations, she doesn't put her faith in the end in the courts. And that's something I've always agreed with. I think that the tendency, especially amongst intellectuals, to think that the courts are going to save us is one of the most dangerous tendencies in the American experiment. And this goes back to maybe my disagreement a little bit with Margaret. I have, in the end, very little faith that the courts will resist a strong democratic movement to do things which many of us think are wrong or unconstitutional or unjust. In the end, I would much rather put my faith in the activism and the engagement of citizens and people. And that comes from a distrust of intellectual cowardice, I guess, that has been proven over and over in the world.
Roger?
Roger?
There's a couple people, but I'll let you guys fight it out. Who I can't.
Gary, you've turned off your phone.
Oh, hi Gary, go for it.
Okay, I am a lawyer, and I think that the phenomenon you just talked about is a feature, not a bug, of self-government, because the idea that courts should be overruling elected officials because the courts decide that they think they know better than the elected officials what the right answer is, gives them a privileged position. And what the courts actually do, and I'm a land use attorney, I represent a lot of neighborhood groups that hope and believe the courts are going to save them from bad decisions, as they see it, by their elected officials. And the courts defer. That's the word, deference. They defer to elected officials because in our system, it may not be working that well all the time, but we believe that elected officials representing us have our power and they should make the key decisions. Courts will only overturn a set of elected officials' decisions if there is, quote, no substantial evidence in favor of the elected official's decision. And as I say, I think that is a feature, not a bug, of self-government and representative democracy. And people really have given up on representative democracy and are hoping the courts are going to save us. The solution is to make representative democracy work.
Hi, Roger. It's
Yeah.
Margaret. I just would say that, I agree with what Gary just said. And I was put in mind of something that Zephyr Teachout said at the conference on civil disobedience in a breakout group, which was, obviously this is not, not a quote, but as I recall it, what she was describing was the fact that we have a breakdown of those, call it public spaces, call it voluntary associations in society that gave people the experience of coming together around common goals. And whether it's a labor union or the PTA, those, while not inherently about protest or civil disobedience, formed that public space where people learn to work together, to speak up for themselves, and to take that action of making the representative system work for them. And it's a breakdown in that she has noted in here, but it's really cascaded in the years since she wrote this. So I wonder, to try to take this essay and overlay it on our current times, wouldn't you have to recreate a whole layer of society that we've all but gotten rid of?
Well, I think these are good questions. Gary and I share a belief that democracy, should be run by active citizens, and that the courts are sort of a last resort. And you say, well, these institutions have faded. I think what also shocked Arendt in the 1960s, because she was always shocked, I think, by America, in often a good way, was how quickly, in the face of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, hundreds of thousands of people did what Jack did and took to the streets. And she was impressed. She had qualms with some of their actions, and she could critique some of them, and she wanted to stay a little bit aloof from it. But she was impressed, and she took that as a deep reaffirmation of the American spirit at a time in which she thought it had been dead. So, when you say, Margaret, it's dead, I say yes, but look what's happened in the last 10 years in this country. First, you have the Tea Party movement. Now, many of you probably don't like the Tea Party movement, but it was an enormously successful citizen activist movement against the Republican Party. And it's won. It's taken over the Republican Party. To look at the power of that citizen action of the Tea Party movement is just astounding to see what they've accomplished in really only 10 years. And then look at, a number of other movements, be it Me Too or Black Lives Matter or the resistance movement. You're seeing citizens now on the left in a similar way. I don't think yet as effectively as the Tea Party did it, become active. um, you know, if the country doesn't fall apart, we may see these 10 years as absolutely essential, crucial years in American history, where a long period of political decay turned around. And part of what Arendt's saying here is that it happens during crises. And what's an interesting, I think what makes this a particularly fraught time is that there are two widely divergent groups, or three even, that think we're in crises, and they think we're in different crises. So there's sort of an identity politics group that think we're in one crisis. There's sort of a democratic power group that thinks we're in another crisis. And then there's the Tea Party group that thinks we're in a crisis of big government and bureaucracy. And so what you're actually seeing is three different civil disobedience movements emerging at around the same time with very different goals. That's I don't, I'm not going to say that's the first time that's happened. I'm sure it's not, but it's an extraordinary moment in American history, and one that we're all living through and should be not only aware of, but maybe participating in. I mean, that's obviously the hope of reading Hannah Arendt, is encourages people to get off at times, put the book down and go actually engage in these kind of questions.
Roger, could
Yeah.
I just say something? It's a little divergent, but I would refer to Boss Tweed and what happened in New York City. And it wasn't the courts, it wasn't the law, it wasn't the citizens, it was the Fourth Estate, specifically the New York Times, that brought Boss Tweed down when it seemed like nothing could bring this guy down. So I think we have to also, and that's been consistent. They Dan's papers, the Pentagon Papers, they printed those. I think that we can't, even though the media looks really, really different now, I think we have to have some belief in the Fourth Estate.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we read it in last week when we talked about her essay, Lying in Politics. She talks about the absolute importance of journalists and the Fourth Estate. And it's interesting that you bring it up now, Harold, because I mean, one of the questions that's emerged about the New York Times in the last 2 years is to what extent the New York Times has joined the resistance, right? I mean, this has been a question that many people have raised, including some people at the Times. And, from Arendt's point of view, the importance of the Fourth Estate is not as a civil disobedience organ, but as a professional organization that insists on facts. And to the extent that not just the New York Times, but so much of journalism has become more and more about analysis and opinion and less about facts. One of the problems is that people don't trust the media. They don't even trust the government. I've been reading this book by William Davies. I don't know how many of you have heard of him, or I forget the name of the book, but it's about crowds versus reason. But one statistic that he mentioned was that in 2016, 86% of Hillary Clinton supporters believed that the government statistical numbers that the government offered were accurate, whereas 13% of Trump supporters did. That's an extraordinary statistic. I mean, if you actually sit down and reflect on it, only 13% of Trump supporters believe that our government offers statistics that are accurate. Now, I don't know. I don't know exactly what they mean by that, but it's clear that institutions like government and the media are losing their objectivity, their sense of being above politics, above the fray. And what I would say is that if you actually believe in the fourth estate and its importance, I think it's more important that the Times and that the fourth estate somehow assert its journalistic independence rather than join the resistance. Now, I'm not saying they have, and I think that it's a very tough thing to do, because one of the things that the Times is confronting is precisely the statistic that I just mentioned, but about government, but it's also true about journalists, is that there are large groups in this country, many in the minority communities, many in the Trump supporting communities, and many others, that simply don't believe what the newspapers say. And so if the newspapers then confront those people and try and say, you're lying, and here are the facts, they look partisan. And I'm not sure there's much of an answer, except that they have to try and say, we're standing up for what we consider the facts to be. But they have to try and do so in a way that that to the greatest degree possible keeps facts separate from opinions. And there's no doubt that our whole media universe has been conflating those two things in the last generation. And that is one of the sources, I think, of the current problems that we're having.
Roger, I could weigh in on that a little bit if I may.
Yeah, Jason?
I've been, I guess in the last year and a half, I've been studying the effect of narrative, particularly found a fantastic bit of work being done from Middle America on narrative policy framework analysis. And this is, again, back to the books and whatnot, but it is there's a very clear burgeoning understanding that facts really don't move narrative. Narrative can be supported by facts, but when you have narratives that are more coherent and have greater continuity, and when we say continuity, reach backwards further into the past, those tend to gather more ethos and thereby convince people not with the logos, but really with the ethos, with the personal experience, and the testimonies. And facts be damned. This is what I experienced, and those narratives become so much more compelling given the fact that now everyone has effectively a worldwide microphone that they can express their narrative. And yeah, the logos and the facts are suffering because they're not backed up by that quality sense of the actual lived experience. And so yeah, I'm not surprised in the least, that is on the decline.
Thanks, Jason. I mean, just to be as provocative as we can, I mean, William Davies, the book that I was mentioning is called Nervous States, and I actually think it's a worthwhile book. He starts the book off by talking about President Trump's insistence that his inauguration crowds were larger than President Obama's. And what he says is that for Trump and many of his supporters, the claim that they were smaller, which the media, in his view, sort of made a narrative, or Trump first said they were bigger, it was part of his ethos, as you're putting it. It was part of his. He was like, look at all these people. It's enormous. It's the biggest ever. And he sort of meant by it not a factual statement, but an emotional statement. A statement of, here's what I'm saying. Look at this great thing. All these people coming out for me. And then the media jumped on it and said, well, actually, factually, it's not the case. And for Trump, the facts weren't the key. And what Davies is saying is, we're living at a time in which, after hundreds of years from the Enlightenment until now, in which we've been increasingly fact-driven in our politics, this is his argument, not mine, but there's some truth to it at least. We're seeing right now the breakdown of a consensus that facts are what determines and should determine our politics, and that we're going to see an increasingly, in his mind, nervous-driven politics. You called it ethos instead of logos. I think there's a number of ways to talk about it, but it's part of the increasing skepticism about elites and elite-driven narratives, which, to bring us back to Arendt, is something that Arendt talks a lot about. So in last week, when we talked about the lying in politics, we talked a lot about her critique of these problem solvers, right? In next week, when we talk about on violence, we're going to encounter her claim that the entry of intellectuals into politics is maybe the most dangerous event of recent history. This is going to be on page 108, which we'll read for next week, but I'll at least mention it now. She's on 108. Under these circumstances, and we'll talk about what they are, indeed, few things are more frightening than the steadily increasing prestige of scientifically minded brain trusters in the councils of government during the last decades. The trouble is not that they are cold-blooded enough to think the unthinkable, but they do not think. Why is it that she thinks brain trusters, intellectuals, do not think? That's a question I'm going to pose for you, and we're going to talk a lot about next week when we raise this question on violence. It's actually what I'm trying to write about right now, so I look forward to that conversation. But what Jason, I think, is saying, if I get it correctly, is that many of us believe that math and numbers are what should determine policy. Well, remember when we were reading her book, The Life of the Mind, and she says that thinking is not about truth, it's about meaning. And I think when Jason talks about ethos instead of logos, that's part of what he's saying, that thinking, and in this case politics, for a number of generations now, increasingly since the 17th century, since Thomas Hobbes and the whole movement of the Royal Society in England that brought statistics and numbers into government, has increasingly been seen as an elite-driven, numbers-oriented, logically driven, progressive idea. And what we're seeing now, it's not the only time that's happened in the last 300 years at all. I'm not saying it is, but we're seeing an enormous rebellion against the violence of logic. How is logic violent? Logic is violent because what logic does is set generalities across society. And if most people in the United States are now in urban areas and educated and have a certain kind of view of cosmopolitanism and the elitism, those numbers are largely going to ignore people who are outside of that, whether they live in a rural area or an inner city or whatever it is. And so policy is increasingly going to leave those people and their feelings out. And so Davies' argument in his book is that we're seeing a return of feelings, and that whole groups of people in our society no longer trust the objectivity of logic. And partly it's because the journalists and the mathematicians and the policy people have gotten too captured by a political viewpoint, an establishment viewpoint. And that creates a sense of disempowerment, which is, so we'll talk about next week, is what leads to violence. And it leads to the glorification of violence, because when you feel disempowered and you feel like your view is not being represented, and yet you don't feel like you have any way to get your view represented, it's very appealing to say, burn the whole house down. and turn to violence. And that's what her essay on violence is really about. Civil disobedience is another response to that feeling of being left out and being disempowered. It's a more productive, in her mind, response. That instead of saying burn the whole house down, says let's fight to have our opinion represented. Let's dissent. And
Roger,
yeah, go ahead.
how about this for a consideration? That one of the problems that you see when you see the turnout at the Trump rallies is that this is not people who have been heavily influenced by the divergent intellectual interpretations or the scientific interpretations. But how about the fact that there is so much there that the Fourth Estate and intellectuals have been able to express divergent views? And for most of us, it's almost so the quantity of information out there is so difficult to absorb. There is so much that is contradictory and that is right, but contradictory, pulling us in all kinds of directions. I'm not sure that it's just the fact that the intellectuals are presented or present themselves as political. But even in pursuing their own field, their own truth, they come up with various, maybe irreconcilable ideas, and the vast majority of people have no access to those. So I'm not sure that it's just the fact that you feel disenfranchised from the power centers, but it's also the overwhelming amount of specialists and information and differing views that are provable.
I think that's fair. I guess the only part I would push back on Daphne is that I think there is increasingly an educated elite view and then other views. I think what you're seeing, I think there's.
Is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez an intellectual elite? See, I don't,
Well, that's an interesting question because I think in many ways she's trying to do to the Democrats what the Tea Party did to the Republicans. So I think she has been she is representing a lot of young people and others who feel that they've been disenfranchised by the intellectual elite. So I would actually, she did go to college and she's an intellectual on one level, but she represents this kind of, I would say, and that's because I'm an elite that she doesn't like, but I respect her immensely, but she represents a kind of emotive ethos against the establishment in the way that Jason was talking about it. And I respect immensely people who engage in that way. I just happen to disagree with a lot of what she says. But I think she's a positive force for democracy in the country, as I think the Tea Party was a positive force for democracy in the country. And I'm glad that the left now has leaders like Alexandria Cortez that are able to respond emotively to the Tea Party. But what's getting shrunk in the middle are the people who believe in sort of an establishment view. And maybe that's good because the establishment view wasn't doing very much for a whole lot of people. It was leaving out a whole lot of people on the left and a whole lot of people on the right. And so we're seeing a major realignment of politics that's just beginning, I think, right now. And so I think that's, in the end, if Gary's still on, I think that's good for democracy. It may mean that for a while policies happen that I don't agree with or I do agree with. I think we'll see. I think we're going to see a lot of swings back and forth. But I think the idea that people are actively engaged and wildly new numbers of people are entering the political sphere for the first time and participating, that's something that is an unmitigated good in my mind for this country.
Roger, I am still on, and I agree with you. And I try to tell all my friends, most of whom are despairing to the deepest degree, that we have great reason to hope that there's fundamental change coming.
Yeah, I mean, I've made that point a number of times as well. I mean, in print as well. I hope I don't come to regret it. I mean, there is reason to hope as long as and until the system as we know it doesn't allow for that kind of resistance and response. I don't think we're there yet at all, but I'm maybe more worried than I was a year ago that we might get there. So, I mean,
Yes, Roger. I think this is I don't want to sound like I'm disagreeing with you, because there's a lot of what you've said that I do really agree with, but I think it's really significantly more complex than the way in which you've described it. I've experienced I've been involved with intellectuals who want to be working class, or who believe that they can act in a way so that the working class will take the lead. And I've seen the dynamics of that. It's very, very complex, because there are people who believed in democracy and who, in the end, really had an undemocratic outlook. I want to remind you that the Nazis ruled by law. They created laws. They made sure that there were laws that justified their behavior, and so the way in which you characterize the laws, I think, has a certain limitation. But the main point I want to make here is it's important, I think, for people to look back and read Jack London's The Iron Heel, because at the core of all of this is something we're going to talk about next time, which is violence, but violence at different levels by different actors, and violence by the state, or violence by organized militia, and so on and so forth, is very different than the impulsive violence that disgruntled people may exercise on the streets. Very different indeed. And I'm not as optimistic as you are at all. I really feel that unless things change very dramatically and very soon, we may really be headed into that fourth century iron heel that Jack London speaks of.
Gary, you want to respond? Because, I mean, I sort of feel like I was maybe in between you and Jack, but I don't know.
I think you might be. And I certainly, in talking about optimism, do not talk about a determined optimism in the sense that I'm very confident everything's going to work out, because I think what was just said is obviously the looming concern, because there are so many bad signs and dark clouds politically, and then in just the real world. Global warming is I'm in California. When your 20,000 houses are burned down, and then that happens once every 10 years, 20 years, maybe the society can sustain the rebuilding involved. When that happens every couple of months, it's not going to be sustainable. And all over the world, we are losing the ability to have a decent civilization because of our own, failure to deal with climate change. I am optimistic, sort of because in the way I was really pleased when you said this earlier, that Hannah Arendt was so surprised by America, because we can surprise ourselves. And I think the climate change, and I like Ocasio-Cortez, the Green New Deal is a way that we can transfer protest, which is just raging against the unacceptability of the world, into transforming the world. I'm hopeful, maybe more than optimistic.
Great.
Well, if we can get the gun control happening and the climate change, I will concede that I'm optimistic. But right now, it doesn't
I
look
love that,
very
Daphne.
it doesn't look that good. And I just wanted to say that I'm also probably not quite, but I'm also very old, and I have been participating in activists group in a different part of the world where for decades we did everything possible to avoid what is now happening, where laws are basically taking civil rights away from third-class citizens in a country where the law is not allowing them to get Social Security, where the law is dictating that they can't have houses. And the governments that have been in charge have moved significantly to the right all the time and increasing that kind of nationalism that is totally scary. And when you look at Hungary and you look at other countries in the world, this is not just America. So I would love to be optimistic. If we could get the guns under control, I mean, a horrible shooting occurs and the president doesn't say anything. He goes off to a rally. You know, this is horrible. And climate change. I mean, you know, God bless Alexandria Cortez. I mean, let's do it.
Let me just say one more thing, Roger, if I might, because I just thought of it as Daphne was speaking. I think it is fundamentally important for us always to realize that we are human in two ways. We are observers and we are actors. And the observations we can make today are dark indeed, but our ability to act remains. And that is the optimism or hopefulness that I call upon us to recollect, and it goes right along with civil disobedience. It is we can do something personally and in connection with others collectively to act to change the reality that we observe to be so unacceptable. And that is going to come to our mind as climate change, as gun violence, as all of these things continue to be the things we observe, and they are fundamentally, absolutely unacceptable, and they are not inevitable, and therefore we can, and I hope, and I believe, we will change them.
I think you're going to run for president, Gary. Everyone else is jumping in. No,
I'd like.
Go. Who?
No, I'm sorry.
saying
Go
that?
ahead. No, you go ahead, Roger. I had something else I wanted to add, but go ahead.
But someone else want to try to speak, right? You got to turn your mic on.
I think it's on, Roger.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Yes.
I've been trying to find something coherent to add here. I thought the man on narrative was very strong, and I connected that with all this, what Daphne's talking about, the plethora of information. Maybe he didn't say that, someone else said that. And that's part of the reason that you have so much of an emphasis on narrative now, is because that's the way to integrate information so that people can get it. They might be misdirected by those narratives, but it's a way of understanding a very complex and dramatically changing situation. So, but I think we get misled with this left-right, because I think really it's top-bottom. Jim Hightower is very good on that. And I think capital has been running the show for quite a while and has taken over through not having campaign finance laws or public financing of campaigns. But capital has run the show so totally for their interest and for profit that the consequences are very negative. Climate change, what used to be called global warming, I think is actually a better phrase, and increasing immiseration and of the majority of people around the world, and these few folks who are able to virtually control the narratives because they have so much money, that all of it has produced this dramatic reaction by the mass of people, including this could be exploited by Urban and Bolsonaro and a whole long Trump, a whole long list of politicians who represent capital and are trying to maintain this control. But on the other hand, we have this upsurge around the world of folks who are very unhappy with what is, but are not so clear about what the alternative is. And that's what's, I think, exciting and interesting about Ocasio-Cortez, and I'm sorry to report that Bernie Sanders, as far as I'm concerned, they are offering, as I think Jack mentioned, a Green New Deal is a specific, viable policy of what to do instead. That's where we need to go, is the instead, and not as just an intellectual proposition, but as some kind of exciting alternative vision of what to do that'll work and will serve Gaia and the vast majority of the people. And that's what is trying to happen, I think. And the other guys have control to an enormous degree. It's true, and they'll continue to try to do that, but it doesn't work. That does not actually offer ordinary people virtually anything, and was certainly not going to fix the climate crisis. Okay, so anyway, that's what I have to add into this conversation.
Great.
Roger, we're approaching the end here.
Someone want to get a last word in?
I want to say something that I had intended to say before. I'm sorry to break your train of thought. I'm very concerned about the use of the term intellectuals for the people, for I don't know exactly what to call technocrats is the way I usually think about them, but the so-called experts and academia in general. That yes, there are academics, and yes, there are technocrats, but intellectuals are not. They don't necessarily comprise the intellectuals, and there are. I like to think of myself as anti-intellectual only because I'm very unhappy with the influence of those people. But obviously, I'm not an anti-intellectual in the way in which I function in the world. So I just want to make that distinction. People who are intellectuals are, in fact, people who either think in the Arendtian sense or want to, and who engage themselves in the work of doing that, including coming to virtual reading groups. So I really, it's very important to me that distinction be made. And your characterization of those, the dissatisfaction with the technocrats and in my case, academics in general, that's correct. People are dissatisfied with that. But it isn't that they're dissatisfied with intellectuals. They're dissatisfied with those people and how they act.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, we can. I think we can try and figure out what the right words for it is. I mean, I think the point is, on the one hand, technocrats, but on the other hand, it's also people who maybe get caught up in concepts and lose sight of certain realities. But we will talk more about that next week because it's going to be a big topic in the book, in the essay on violence, which will start next week. And if we don't finish the whole thing, maybe we'll split it into 2 parts. But we'll be meeting next week on Friday, and I hope you enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. I think On Violence is one of my favorite essays of hers, so please do enjoy it, and we'll see you next week. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much. I've got to run. Bye-bye, everyone.